Family Education Workshop in partnership with Archway Academy and Fusion Academy. We want to extend a very warm welcome to everyone. We are so glad that you're here. This partnership series was created in response to a shared understanding and awareness of the need for relevant resources for families as we all navigate the changes we're experiencing as a result of the impact COVID has created in our nation, our communities, and our homes. We fully understand we're navigating uncharted territory and collectively agree that sharing our resources not only with our professional communities, but our communities at large is our privilege and our responsibility as we make our way forward in our new normal. My name is Amanda Franklin. I'm one of the National Referral Relations representatives here at Skyland Trail. And before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about us. As many of you know, Skyland Trail specializes in treating adolescents and adults with primary psychiatric diagnoses. And our adolescent program focuses on teens aged 14 to 17 with depression, anxiety, bipolar disorders. And our residential and day treatment programs for adults focuses on mood, thought, and anxiety disorders. And our specialized programs help young adults experiencing their first episode of psychosis or struggling with co-occurring alcohol or substance abuse. Next, I would like to introduce you to Jamie Edwards, who is the Director of Community Relations for Archway Academy. And Jamie, your camera is not on yet. There you go. Okay.
First of all, I want to thank you, Amanda and Skyland Trail, for partnering with us. We really appreciate this opportunity. Archway Academy is a sober high school in Houston, Texas. We meet the individual and educational needs of teens 14 up to 21 who are recovering from substance use disorder with care, compassion, respect, and rigor. We opened our doors in 2003 to offer students and worried families in the throes of teenage substance use a viable option and support system for restoring their child physically, mentally, emotionally, and academically. Instead of returning students to the same environment in which they're most at risk for relapse or where it's nearly impossible to catch back up academically after treatment, we provide a structured place for teens to continue both their recovery and their education without compromising either. Today, we are the largest recovery high school in the country, and our mission is to provide a supportive and sober learning environment to meet the individual educational needs of adolescents and young adults in recovery. To learn more, please visit our website at www.archwayacademy.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. And our partnership with Fusion is being represented by Sarah Grice, who is their Director of Communications in Atlanta.
Hello, everyone. Yes, so here at Fusion, we have a revolutionary way of building school through meeting the students where they're at. So we work with them on a one-to-one basis. We're fully accredited, and we work on learning solutions to help them socially, emotionally, and academically. We partner with our local resources to help make those students really customize their learning experience and get them on the right path and successful path to graduation. We have 58 campuses across the U.S., and we have 2 here located in the Atlanta area. So where you can reach out for us is at fusionacademy.com.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. Thank you both. So questions are welcomed and encouraged. If during the presentation you would like to ask a question to one of our speakers, please utilize the Q&A feature, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. We're going to set aside 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer as many questions as possible. And please don't be shy, we won't share your name, just your questions. Also, I'm excited about this too. This presentation includes a mindfulness exercise with our art therapist. So quickly, if you could grab a piece of paper and something to write with, we are going to do this exercise with her as she teaches us all something new. And before we begin our presentation, I want to introduce our presenter. Dr. Katrina Goines grew up in South Africa and came to the U.S. to complete her PhD in clinical psychology at Emory University in Atlanta. She currently works as the Director of Clinical Services at Skyland Trail's Adolescent Program, where she sees patients with mood and anxiety disorders, while also supervising and coordinating other aspects of clinical care, including group programming and family therapy. Her co-presenter is Elise Roche, and she is a creative arts therapist for our adolescents and families at Skyland Trail. She is a fully registered art therapist as well as an associate licensed counselor in the state of Georgia. She completed her Master's of Science at Florida State University and had an emphasis in working with teens and families providing trauma-informed care in shelters. She leads residential clinical art therapy groups at Skyland Trail through a dialectical behavioral therapy and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy lens. She also works with adolescents individually as they step down to outpatient care, as well as co-facilitates family art therapy workshops and presentations. Her main goal with every client is to use art therapy to process, identify, explore issues within families, systems, and selves. Thank you both for taking the time to share your knowledge and experience with us today.
Thanks, Amanda. So as she was saying, I'm Katrina, and we have Elise here as well. We're going to start with a little mindfulness exercise led by Elise.
So, hey y'all, we're going to go ahead and start off with an art therapy directive that I have used a lot with our teens and our families. This is one of my favorite ones because it requires absolutely no art skills. It is just about recording down your experience with something. So I'm going to ask everyone to take a really non-judgmental lens and approach here. And so we're going to start with a blind contour. And that is something that uses our mindfulness skills, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and takes into consideration our perception of an object. So we're going to use our hands. So I'm going to be using my right hand because I'm left-handed. So I want everyone to put up their non-dominant hand, and you can put it in some shape if you want, just make something funky. And what you're going to do is first, no drawing at all, just with our eyes. We are going to trace the lines of our hand visually. So you would like trace the whole, maybe go in where there's some lines or some cracks. So you're going to do that with your mind slowly for your entire hand first. So we'll do this with our mind first together. And you're just moving your eyesight along every edge and curve and straight line of your hand until you get back to the point you began at. And once you come back to the point you started, we're going to do it again, but this time with your dominant hand, you're going to get your marking utensil. And you're going to put it on your page, just on a point, any point on your page. And we're going to do the exact same thing, only looking at your non-dominant hand, not your image. And you're going to trace the line with your mind again, and your hand's going to follow that. So your hand is just moving with what your mind is tracing. You're not looking at your image and you're not picking up your pen. And again, I find it easiest to start at like my tallest point, and we trace really slowly until we return to that tallest point. So we'll do it slowly. And once you've completed, everyone can have a fun time with me and look down at their hand and laugh a little bit, because it probably does not look like a hand. Honestly, this picture is not the best one I chose for this presentation, because the point of it is that it does look really funny. It doesn't, if it looks like a hand, you probably cheated. And if it doesn't, then congratulations, you did a great job. The idea here is that we are looking fully at the hand and considering how we perceive that stimuli. And the reason that this is such an important directive for us is that you have to be mindful during the experience. So mindfulness is a huge piece of what we do at Skyland and a core tenet of DBT, which we'll be talking a little bit more about, and that is just being wholly in the moment. I imagine that while you're doing that, it was hard to think about anything else, and that's the whole point. Especially since we use two senses, we're using that like tactile sensory as well as visualizing it. That lets us tap into that mindfulness state even easier. And doing these types of practices intentionally will allow for a more mindful state when we need it most, when we may be distressed. I also really like it because it takes into perception more than just how we see things. It takes into consideration where that hand is in proximity to you, or what your perception of the hand is. If we're thinking like, if you drew that and then your teen or your partner was sitting right here and they drew that same hand, it would look nothing like yours. They would look nothing like each other and probably nothing like a hand. And they're both valid. They are both true forms of your experience. So they're both correct. There's no right way or wrong way that hand exists. It exists the same way it exists differently to everyone, and all of those are valid. Also, my favorite piece is that you can't control this one. There was no way this was going to look great or perfect or flawless. And it allows us to consider how our experience is shifted when our need for control or judgment is silenced, which is a big piece of moving forward and finding the middle path in what we're going to do today.
So what we're covering today, so we're going to talk a little bit about dialectics and what dialectics are. So things like conflicts between parents and teens. We're going to go over some of the most common conflicts, as well as doing a little bit of problem solving around some of these conflicts and finding a middle path. So Elise mentioned DBT. So DBT is one of the dialectical behavioral therapy is what DBT stands for. And it's one of the modalities that we borrow from in our treatment of teens with mood disorders. DBT is really helpful for helping parents and teens and families regulate their emotions and behaviors, helps them to reduce problem behaviors, so things like cutting or things like avoiding schoolwork, and instead increase skillful behaviors that are more in line with their ultimate goals. It helps individuals to experience a range of emotions without necessarily acting on those emotions in the moment. And the overarching goal of DBT is not that individuals be happy or that everything sort of go well in their life, but that they create a life worth living, so that they find meaning and fulfillment in the life that they have. A lot of what we're doing is taken pretty directly from the DBT Skills Manual for Adolescents by Jill Rathos and Alec Miller, and I've noted that at the bottom of this slide.
So a big part of learning about DBT is really exploring what does it mean? What is a dialect? So a dialect just means that two opposing ideas can exist at the same time and both be true. So when we're thinking about what could fall into this, we're considering that with the hands, that both of those images are valid and both of those images were true, even though they may look like complete and total opposites. And how we do this, what we're focusing on with the teenagers especially, is moving from either but thinking to both and thinking. So for example, you may think that at times I'm a leader and at other times I'm a follower. And that even though those are opposites, if we're considering the situation and all the other factors, they can both be true at the same time. One that we really hone in on is validating that you're doing the best you can in this moment, and I hope you can do better moving forward. Or changing that self-talk from I'm a bad kid, I'm a bad parent, I'm a bad girlfriend, to I'm doing the best I can in this moment and I can do better moving forward. So we're really validating that most of the times we're doing the best we can with the tools we have, and we can strive to keep doing better in the future.
So it seems like a pretty simple shift, going from but to and, but it really can do a lot to not invalidate the first part of the sentence that you just said. So Elise would often give the example of saying, well, Katrina, you did a good job preparing this presentation, but you didn't give me any chance to speak, and it was really unfair. That would very quickly, I wouldn't even remember her compliment at the beginning of the sentence. But switching to an and usage really does make those two things hold equal weight, such that you're not really invalidating the first part of what you're saying, and you're better able to communicate like all aspects of what you're trying to discuss.
So another core piece of DBT is the 3 states of mind. So this graphic does a really good job of explaining it. We've got reasonable mind, and that's where we take into account past experience, research, logic, statistics. It's really black and white. It's really clear. It's really algebra. And then we're thinking emotional mind. And those are if the feelings, the anxiety, the fear, the stress, the sadness. And a lot of times our decisions can come out of one of those places. And sometimes if it's just coming from one, it may not be the most effective decision. So wise mind is where those two come together, where the consideration of both is acknowledged. An example I use for this is you're looking for a house. And if you're fully functioning in reasonable mind, you see 3 come up on Zillow. One has better odds, one has better statistics, one just got a roof replaced last year. And the statistics are showing that it will increase in value by 8% in 3 months. You buy the house without even looking at pictures, going to check it out, or getting a feeling for it. Emotional mind, that's going to be when you see a house on the street with a for sale sign, you walk right in, the feeling in the living room is terrible, and the walls remind you of a class you really hated in elementary school where a girl bullied you. You hate the house, you don't look at anything else, you end your whole house hunt, and you go live at your parents' basement. So now we function out of emotional mind. We really let our feeling take advantage of the situation and be in control. And a wise mind decision may be seeing all those houses, really looking at the odds and the logic there, and then going and getting a feel for them. And we're in our wise mind when we're considering like, well, I can't paint to change this paint color, and the walls is only $8, and but this house saves me $100,000. And if I paint this, then I go back in, and then I see if I get a different feeling, and I consider all that in the house with the logic, and then I have a wise mind decision that I'm probably a lot more proud of.
So we're always trying to sort of make decisions from wise mind, but it's very easy to get into this emotion mind place. And emotion mind really is where we find ourselves getting pretty stuck, often with regard to like conflicts and dialectics that we see within families. So some of the more common conflicts that we see arising between parents and teens are regarding curfew, grades, school, dating, friends, driving, computer, internet, phone access, and sort of what they do with their free time. So this image here is kind of showing, you know, these different paths diverging, and oftentimes we think about these dialectics within families as a parent on one side and a teen on the other side. So they're on two sides of the extreme, and they're kind of stuck, and they're not able to sort of move forward together. Another way in which you might see a dialectic happening with regard to parenting is if you yourself as a parent are flipping back and forth from one extreme to the other. So an example might be if a parent was really on top of everything and was working very hard to make sure that, you know, since COVID, their kid has been doing online school, and they're making sure that they're getting all their grades in, asking them every day, are you doing your work? Do you need to do this now? Do you need to do this next? And at the end of the semester, they find that the grades aren't really good either way, even though they were putting in so much time and effort to help them. They might be tempted to be like, oh, I give up. I'm not doing this anymore. I won't be the person controlling this. It's up to you to figure it out. So that would be an example of shifting from one dialectic to the other very quickly and kind of flipping to those extremes. And whether it's yourself flipping to extremes, your co-parent being on one side or other of the extreme, or yourself and your teen being stuck on these extremes, the problem is that it doesn't move you forward in one path, which is what we're hoping to get to in this middle path. As you see, the middle path in the middle of the two diverging paths moves forward in one direction, and that's what we're hoping to speak with you more about in this sort of analogy or metaphor. So in order to walk the middle path, we need to address, as I was saying, those extreme positions that people can take by thinking more dialectically in a more nuanced way about how both of those positions could have some truth to them. These skills that we're about to sort of go through more didactically and one by one can help people to consider the alternate points of view and how to walk the middle path and what that looks like behaviorally speaking. The major problem that we find is it's very hard to access a middle path mindset or a wise mind space when you're an emotion mind or when there's an extreme emotion that you're experiencing. So, for example, if you were very worried about a teen and they were not coming home curfew and you were concerned about what that might mean for their safety, you might, as soon as you see them walk through the door, sort of overreact without meaning to. Say you're grounded for 6 months, you're not going to see any of your friends. And that's an understandable response to that very, very extreme emotion of fear. It's not a sustainable sort of parenting decision in that moment. And so that's, again, one of the situations that we will often find ourselves in if we're not careful of sort of staying in as much of a wise mind space as possible.
So something we hear from our parents a lot is that, middle path sounds like a great idea, but my kid won't do that. My kid won't come to a compromise. We've tried this XYZ and it won't work. So what we want to do is give you guys the skills and tools to actually put this great cloud of an idea into practice in your real life. So like I said before, how to move to the both and way of thinking. How we can do that is to avoid extreme words such as always, never, you make me. Those types of words can really invite a rebuttal. If I'm really upset with Katrina and I say, like, you make me feel unheard, I feel really left out, and you always talk first, you always present the first slide, she's probably not going to focus on that I feel left out and unheard, because now she has to fight back that she doesn't always let me present the first slide. And the last slideshow I did 13 of the 14 slides, and now we're in an argument. So now we're even deeper into emotional mind, and my feelings have been pushed under the rug. But if I had started with, I feel this way when, or I feel really left out, and that makes me feel like I'm not a big part of whatever this is, and that's where I stop the sentence. Then Katrina doesn't have a choice but to hear me, and she doesn't have a choice. She can't tell me I don't feel that way. That's not a valid argument. So by avoiding those extremist words, we're able to hopefully ease a little bit more towards the middle ground instead of sinking deeper into emotional mind. Also, by finding the kernel of truth in every side, by asking yourself, what am I missing here? So an example we really like is if a teenager really, really wants to dye their hair purple, and you know that it's going to ruin their blonde hair, that it's going to really perceive how the teachers are perceiving them, college admission interviews are coming up soon, and that's not going to be a good look, and it may affect their possibility of getting a job, and it's not in line with your family values. Those are your truths, and those are absolutely valid. But we also need to consider what am I missing here? Am I able to put myself in their shoes when I was a teenager, and fitting in was truly life or death for me, was the most important thing on my brain. Are they feeling left out, or is that what this is about? Is there something that I can lean into? Is there something that I can understand here? Because if it's, then down below we see checking your assumptions, like what did you mean when you, so maybe in that situation it would be, do you think you'd feel more like you fit in if you had purple hairs? Or do a lot of people at the school, is that what they're doing right now? And then you may get corrected. You may be like, no one else has done it, and I really want to do it because I really want to be different, and being different is important to me. There's something else you can lean into, and there's another way to find that middle path instead of, I want to dye my hair purple and I need to or I'll die, and you absolutely cannot. Because if we're both in those states of mind, that's logic and emotion. We need to find that kernel of truth, that missing piece. And also the final one is, don't expect others to know what you're thinking. You can say a lot of what I'm trying to say. What we hear from parents a lot is they're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. And that doesn't mean we don't try at all. We can say, I don't have the words to say, but I'm really worried about you. Or just really clarifying. Because if we get to the end of that purple hair argument and you've had it, you've used all your tools, and you say, I give up, forget it, and you're just talking about the argument, but they hear, I give up, forget it, you can shave your hair purple and you can dye your hair purple and shave your head. Now we have more problems than we had when we started the argument. So all the clarification you can do on your part to check your, to have them know what you're thinking, and the clarification you can do on their part to check your assumptions is going to be really helpful in actually finding that middle path.
So some common examples of adolescent family dialectical dilemmas are represented on this slide. So one is the dialectic between being too strict or being too loose. So as we've sort of mentioned before, it could be you as a parent who sometimes flip from being too strict to too loose on a particular issue. It may be you and your co-parent, and how you both may take that role at a different point in time, like either the too strict or the too loose. Or it could be that, you know, you and your teen have very different expectations for how strict a parent should be of a teen. Another example is making light of problem behaviors and making too much of typical teenage behaviors. So an example of the purple hair situation. So if the argument and effort and energy was going into having your teen not dye their hair purple, and yet on the other side they're maybe sneaking out and meeting people much older than themselves, or they're cutting or engaging in self-harm, and that's not being addressed, and that would be an example of a time when we're making too much light of a problem behavior and making too much typical teenage behavior, being the wanting to dye one's hair. We're going to talk about that one in a little bit more depth, because to kind of understand that a little bit more, we do have to have some understanding of what we consider to be typical teenage behavior and what is actually crossing the line between typical to actually a cause for concern. So that can be confusing with teens. And then another dialectical dilemma that we sometimes see is this sort of dilemma between forcing independence on someone, so sort of giving up and allowing them to control everything and make their own decisions at a time when they're probably too young or developmentally not prepared to do so, versus fostering dependence, so doing too much for teens such that they're not able to start developing that independence. That's really important. We're going to be, as I mentioned, focusing on this one in the middle, and going to be talking a little bit more about what exactly some teenage behaviors are that we do tend to expect from teens, and which behaviors we really want to make note of and are really cause for concern that probably need some external help with. Before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit about teenage brains.
So on this graph on the left here, we've got an image of the different parts of the brain, and we see the red is the limbic system. So that is control, that is like in control of our emotions and our reward system and our protection and our eating. All of that is in that part of the brain. That's one of the first ones to develop. That's one of the ones that if we're thinking like how does a lizard think, like eat food now, survive, sleep, reward, instant gratification, that type of stuff. And then if we're looking at the frontal cortex, so that blue piece, that lid, if you hear someone say like, oh, they flipped their lid, that's where this term comes from. That prefrontal cortex is where all of our decision making and our long-term thinking and comparative thinking and abstract thinking, that's all where that's stored, and that's still forming in the teenage years. That actually doesn't stop forming until we're about 26 or 27. That's where your car insurance goes down at that age. So that is what is kind of like the lid over the limbic system. So when someone's freaking out or kind of like in that fight or flight, that limbic piece, that's that flipped lid. And if we're thinking of a teenager and what their brain looks like and how it's developing, that limbic system is getting a lot of the blood and a lot of the growth. It's where they've actually shown, they've done studies that if where you're using your brain the most, that's going to continue growing the strongest. So especially if we're in emotional mind a lot of the time, or not in that middle ground a lot of the time, we're going to keep pumping blood to that limbic system and strengthening that or enlarging that instead of the frontal cortex, that piece, that logic, the reasoning skills.
So there's a graph as well, if you'll turn your attention to the graph here on the right side. This is from B.J. Casey's paper on the adolescent brain from 2008, and has really helped to shape how we understand adolescent brain development. So you'll see on the x-axis here is age, and on the y-axis is functional development of a specific brain area. So the limbic system, again, this reward system, the sort of immediate gratification, wanting something, our sort of go, that system is pretty fully developed, almost close to fully developed by the time someone hits adolescence. So it's really been sort of revved up and rearing and ready to go. At the same time, our prefrontal cortex, like Elise was saying, which is really what is more sort of the planning and decision-making and future-oriented thought, that has not fully developed and won't fully develop until we're about 26. So there's this period of time where there's a significant gap between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. And this gap here really does create a pretty risky environment where a teen is very motivated by a lot of behaviors and a lot of fun, sensation-seeking, risk-taking, and often in a social context, because that is what's most rewarding to teens, but they don't have the ability to think far in the future and use that to inform their behavior in the moment. So this is what we think of as sort of a risk period for teens, and why we see a lot of typically developing teens making some really poor decisions at this time.
So we want to go in a little deeper on what is typical and what is cause for concern. So in having this brain development piece really helps deepen our understanding of what we can expect to see and what we should probably seek some more help with if we do see, and what we can really be concerned with as abnormal or as cause for concern, instead of the behavior that goes along with that developmental stage. And that's not to say that the things in the typical range are allowed in your household or go without consequence. That's very valid. A lot of these things are a little dangerous and should have some consequences. But knowing what's typical will help determine what the right punishment, consequence, reward system is needed for that behavior. So we're used to seeing moodiness. That's something to be expected. Concern would be long-lasting low moods, panic attacks, self-injury, suicidal thinking. Very typical to be self-conscious or have concerns with body image. A cause for concern would be binging, purging, social withdrawal, really letting that body image concern rule their life. We're used to seeing increased parent-teen conflict. This is the period where they're trying to differentiate as much as possible, and if that's to disagree with you on every single thing in the world, that's what it's going to take. So that's something that we're really used to seeing at this age. What would be cause for concern is aggression, running away. Typical to see experimenting with drugs, alcohol, vaping. Again, they're on that instant gratification reward system. That's what's running their brain at this time. Concerning would be repeated substance abuse, selling drugs, a whole substance using peer group. Typical to have a sense of invulnerability. Like we said, that risky period that they may feel like they can't be touched because all they're thinking about is what's important within the next 30 seconds. And so that the concern there or the vulnerability or considering safety, that's going to come with our more prefrontal cortex regions. But if we're looking at excessive risk-taking, that's when it's concerning. Multiple accidents, driving drunk, getting arrested. Typical to be stressed about school, difficult transitions. Cause for concern would be school refusal, bullying or being bullied, or dropping out.
To continue, it would also be typical for us to see increased argumentativeness, idealism, being more opinionated, so teens really developing their own individual self. Cause for concern would be if the rebelliousness from your teen is causing much trouble between family members, and especially teachers and others in authority. So if it's just between family members, typically that's considered typical. When it extends to people outside of the family, including teachers and others of authority, that's when we start to really notice and know that that's an issue for concern. Sexual interest or experimentation is, of course, very normal for teens. Unsafe sexual practices, a significant age gap between sexual partners, and pregnancy are significant causes for concern. A desire for privacy is very normal in teens. Isolating from family for long periods of time, routinely lying or hiding things is more of a cause for concern. A strong interest in technology and social media is super common in teens. We want to be really careful about how many hours kids are spending on screens, and especially what websites and such that they're visiting. So high-risk websites or apps, meeting people in real life who they've only otherwise met online, or revealing too much personal information online, including addresses or mental health status, etc. That's a cause for concern. Messy room is pretty common when it comes to teens. Rotting food or not being able to find basic necessities in one's room, that's more problematic. And then a shift in sleep cycles is very typical. So teens do tend to go to sleep a little later and wake up a little later. That's a very normative developmental shift that happens. But staying asleep all day, being up all night, or not being able to make appointments because of this sleep schedule, that's a cause for concern. When we say a cause for concern, this is when we probably want to start looking at whether there is a professional who we could at least ask for advice or potentially sort of refer to help our kid. So this will help us, again, in thinking of what the middle path is between this dialectic of making too much of typical teen behaviors and making light of problem behaviors. We really need to recognize when a behavior crosses that line and make sure to get relevant help for that behavior. So reaching out to a professional in that case. And at the same time, it's really important to remember which behaviors are actually part of typical teenage development. Again, as we were saying, that doesn't mean that it doesn't go without consequences or that you can't parent them and teach them the ways in which you hope that they will develop, but to know sort of what level of consequence that is. So you may not need to call the psychologist because your teen wants to dye their hair purple. But some of the other things that we just mentioned probably would be worth a talk to a professional.
And it's worth noting that I was working with a family one time, and they really helped me understand kind of their experience with this, of the making light of problem behaviors doesn't come from a lack of caring or a lack of love for their teen. It's the opposite. It's they care so much and they love them so much. And this specific parent didn't have the tools or knowledge to deal with self-harm. It wasn't something she'd experienced in her family. It wasn't something she had a lot of resources on. And so that felt like a really scary topic that was totally out of her control. So it just wasn't talked about or touched, which left the teen feeling pretty unheard and left her feeling terrified. And then we're looking at the other side of this dialect of making too much of typical teen behaviors. And when you feel out of control and you're seeking some grounding, she understood chores. She could control chores. She could control, her daughter not doing the dishes because the depression was flaring up or whatever it was. And she felt that leaning all the way that way, may help the behaviors or problems she wasn't sure how to deal with. So if we're thinking of that diet we talked about at the beginning, that we're doing the best we can and we can do better. If she was doing the best she could at that time of trying to have a grounded, controlled, safe household, and she was learning the skills with us in therapy to find that middle path a little easier. So takeaways, things that we hope that we have been able to help us understand a little more is that different points of view can both be valid. Both of those hand drawings, as silly as they look, are both your true and authentic perception of the hand of the world, of your life. And even though they can look completely different and be from completely different points of view and heights and brain development, that both of those are valid and both of those are real. We also hope that we helped a little bit with acknowledging valid kernels of truth, leaning in and putting yourself in those shoes of, when I was a teenager, what was my purple hair? What was my thing that I really needed to fit in with everyone? What was it like to feel excluded? What was it like to have friends that may flake on me because of the color of my hair or my shoes or my shorts or whatever it was? And, if I can really relate to that feeling, then maybe I can help find a middle path or a middle ground, or even just validate that fear or that sense of wanting to belong.
And of course, understanding teenage brains and how it influences behavior is also really important when trying to think about parenting and enforcing consequences, and which behaviors require what types of consequences. So again, as we've gone back to with the purple hair, that may still be something that you wish to put some consequences on in your household, but that doesn't, like I said, necessitate, residential care or necessarily even like a call to a psychologist. But some of the other behaviors that we mentioned would, and we want to make sure to take note of those every time they happen, because those are serious, and we want to communicate to our team that we care about that, and we want to get them the help that they need. Okay. So if anybody has any questions, please make sure to send those in, because we'd love to hear from you and answer any questions you have.
Thanks, Katrina and Elise, for that fabulous presentation. This is Dawn. I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator for Skyland Trail, and I'm watching the Q&A box for our presenters tonight. Here's a question that I think probably everybody wants to know about, and it's finding a middle path on this one is tough, especially nowadays since we're got limited activities. What do you recommend when it comes to the big argument about how much time they spend on their cell phones?
That's a huge one. I think that's probably the most frequent issue we have, especially when we transition kids from, we have a residential level of care and then into our intensive outpatient or just to plain old outpatient care. Parents are very concerned about teens and their use of phones, and rightly so. We've definitely seen some scary things happen. So there are several things that we've seen that can be really, really helpful. One is, at least when we transition kids right from residential to intensive outpatient, we always require that they hand in their phone at night so that they do not sleep with their cell phone. We know it's bad for them for many reasons. It's just too tempting. We know how teens' brains work, and we know how adults' brains work. It's very hard to not look at your phone when it's right next to you, and that blue light's really not good for your sleep patterns. So we always advise that teens hand their phones into their parent at bedtime, and that their parent lock it somewhere that is not accessible to their teen, because if it were accessible to a teen, they're going to get it. It's just asking for conflict on that issue. Now, if you don't have that system set up at home, and you don't have the therapist who can go in there and tell the teen that this is how it's going to go down, that would be hard to enforce. So there are some other strategies that I've seen parents find which are really helpful. So I think it's an app that you can put on your phone where essentially you can lock access to any of the apps except for music, so that a teen could use music to help them sleep, but they cannot text anybody, they cannot email, they cannot get onto some of their other social media. So that's a great example of a way we could make it a conflict-free situation, that after a certain hour, your phone is locked. And then another option that has been really effective is switching off the internet at a certain time. And that will prevent teens from being able to get on, whether it was on their computer or on their phone, to access anything after hours. Again, that does take something on the parents' behalf to be willing to do that. But once you have it set up, it's not going to take long, and it's pretty conflict-free. Again, you don't have to interact around that issue. So specifically around bedtime, we always want to make sure that teens are not on their phones.
And when we're considering the kernel of truth aspect here, is that with Corona, that a lot of the socializing is happening through social media, on the internet. So, the rules that may have made more sense when our day was filled with activities may have to be reconsidered now, and may have to have looked at what the truths are and how that middle path is found. I've joked around that it can be really fun to get creative with how that's used. If it can be used as more as a reward and something that they earn. And maybe the joke I had was that if a teenager could earn just a whole day of like video games and phone as a big reward, as something that they're really working up towards, that's a creative way that they really feel like they get a win, and something that we can use for leverage for more understanding and more middle paths on some things they might have more difficulty with.
Yeah. And a lot of times parents have used phones as a consequence of taking away a phone if a teen does not do a certain chore or something else that is an expectation. I've been more lenient around that regarding COVID, just because we see how much that reduction in like social interaction really impacts kids' mental health. And for a lot of them, the phone really is their access to a lot of their friends. So I'm cautious about pulling it away entirely, but I'm totally fine with this, with a situation where you would, you know, the daily chore would allow you to use your phone the next day. And that could repeat every day, so that there's always a chance for them to earn that back the next day. And it doesn't feel as though they're without access to the outside world forever and ever.
Great. We all have to wrestle with that one. Two more great questions. One is, my daughter gets very upset when I ignore her when she is yelling or trying to start an argument. I tell her I'll talk to her when she's calm, but she takes my ignoring as not caring and gets angrier.
That's a great one. So we talk a lot in our groups and in our parenting sessions about validation and how important that is. So ignoring really I think on the simplest level, validation would be attention. So attending to somebody, noticing what they're saying, and like absorbing why it's important. That's validation. If you can communicate that, so saying, I see that you're upset, or I see that you're angry about this, that would be sort of a verbal form of validation. And when people do not get validation for especially intense emotions, you tend to find that their emotions escalate. So it actually doesn't sort of lessen it. What's an example? So an example that we frequently see is like, if you were upset and somebody says, oh, just relax. That typically has, for a lot of people, the impact of making you more upset, because it's pretty invalidating, as though it were just that easy to use a switch to calm yourself down. At the same time, if you're in a situation where a teen is really escalating and becoming angry and maybe even escalating to the point of throwing things or yelling or swearing, you can't engage in a conversation that is productive at that point. So I think what I would suggest at that point is actually that the conversation happen in a neutral time, and that we have a conversation about how and when, like what will work for you when we're in that mode. So when you do become upset and you start yelling or screaming at me, I feel as though it's not a productive use of our time. How can I communicate that to you in a way that is not going to make things worse? Or how can I be supportive of you in that moment? Now, what they might say is, hey, I just want you to like hear me out. I said, that's okay, and I have my limits. Like, I'm not okay with you swearing. I'm not okay with you yelling at me. If you can communicate to me in ways that are not those, then I will hear you out. But if it becomes escalated, we're going to have to wait until you are able to calm down to have that conversation.
And if we're thinking about I'm seeking the kernel of truth here, like what a validation, like a valid response that the teen may be seeking there is the same level of emotion. Something has happened, and this has obviously triggered a really high emotional response. And if she can get you to meet her there, then that's really validated, because that's shown her that response is okay, and that level of emotion ability is okay. And then your kernel of truth, your validation there is that you know that's not that is not how you want the response to be. So meeting her there and fully validating that and letting her know that's okay, or getting to that level too, isn't ideal. So finding a middle path there could also look like hearing her out, asking, ask like, oh, I see you're really upset here. And also considering that if I'm a teen and I'm hearing, I'll talk to you when you're calm, and we're thinking how their brain's going to translate that may sound like your words aren't valuable right now, or the feeling may not be valuable right now if we can't discuss things till we're calm. So like Katrina said, finding an alternative, or speaking when both sides are neutral, of like, how can I support you in that motion in that time? Maybe she wants the yelling and screaming match, but we could settle on doing something creatively that gets a lot of energy out, or or something really comforting to the teen, or, you know, a snack and a blanket, and, you know, leaving her alone for 15 minutes and then being able to talk. But I really like the finding a neutral space and then being able to ask her, like, what can I do that's most helpful for you at that time? Because 0 out of 10 times are they going to say yell back harder, even though that's what it really looks like they want you to do to validate that feeling for them.
That's a great question.
Yeah, and one more, really relevant right now. What is a middle ground around socializing in person in the time of COVID?
Man, that's a great one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've had that issue come up, and I think this is one of the things where I have to say, you know, we can give you a lot of advice, and it's going to depend on your personal and family situation. So I don't know who's at risk in your household, or what exactly it would mean if somebody were to be infected. So I think it really is an issue of finding a middle ground that makes sense for you. So I've definitely had a situation where I felt, as the therapist, that it was really, really important for the teen that I was working with that they do socialize in some form. So hopefully, like, what I was wanting was essentially that they would find a job that was well protected, but something where they could actually leave the house. So in some cases, and in that case, I was thinking that the risk of not socializing really outweighed the benefit to the family, or what else was going on for them in that situation, because she was so depressed, and this really was the cause of her depression. In another situation, and that if that wasn't what I was dealing with, where like a depression that could potentially be life-threatening, I might not make that same suggestion that she go out and get a job. So it really is going to depend on like that specific situation, and it's just a great question. I hope Elise has a better answer.
I mean, I have a answer. I've been thinking the same thing of how I've been handling this and how I've been handling this with our clients of, you know, a big part of what I do is art groups and art therapy groups, and whether they're clinical or more expression-based, it's the socialization piece is one of the most important pieces. So I really want that to continue. And then I'm also a very cautious person. So what I've been seeking is any like online type classes or groups or just activities that we can find and get them in. So, you know, it's not an all or nothing. It's not going to the mall with all your friends in the middle of a pandemic, and it's not sitting at home on TikTok all day. You know, it's a little bit, maybe a little bit of both, or getting to go from a restaurant, eating it outside with a friend from far away, and then later coming to do your online the last one we did was anime. So there was like an anime course that she found online for free. And, you know, really getting creative with like, that's still socialization, and that's still, you know, activity-based things. Or there's apps that teens can do with their friends that is just games. So, you know, at least that they're socializing with each other and playing, you know, little phone games. I'd prefer that over someone on Facebook all day. So I think that's my answer is leaning into it and getting really creative with, maybe you try all 5 of those things one week and 4 of them were terrible. But then, you know, you found one that you can do and something that you can look forward to and still kind of meet that socialization need in a safe way.
I think we have maybe time for this last question. It's a common one again, but it's a dilemma. My son's father does not set boundaries and enforce consequences. How do I handle this?
Yeah, so that's also one that we definitely run into. That is tough. So because your son's father doesn't enforce boundaries doesn't mean that you don't have boundaries. It is still fair to have your own boundaries, especially if you are in sort of a co-parenting relationship with this child. If not, you have boundaries simply because you're an individual, and another individual can be expected to respect those boundaries. This is a really, really tricky topic, and I would suggest that it largely be done with your son's father, so that the discussion be between the two of you, and that dialectic, you're kind of on the other sides of that dialectic right now, that too strict, too loose. and working to set reasonable boundaries that both of you can kind of enforce while the kid is with you, and that may mean giving for sort of on both sides. So he may have to sort of do more boundary setting than he's comfortable with, and you may need to be letting more things go than you're comfortable with, in order to sort of move forward in that like parenting like in a middle path sort of route. But that's a really great question, and it's just a much trickier dynamic if there's, you know, a step parent sort of involved in the situation.
Absolutely. I was going to say the same thing, that we do look to this a lot for the parents as a whole, separate from the kid, of what is the kernel of truth there? Is it that you both, I believe you said son, Don, that you both really want your son to love you the most he can and feel that less boundaries or more boundaries is best. But if that kernel of truth is that it's focusing on like the love and caring relationship, then how can we kind of come together and both loosen up a little bit here and tighten up a little bit here, or just get more creative with it? You know, maybe mom takes dad's schedule for a day and dad takes mom's schedule for a day, or whatever it may take to let the kid be a part of that too, I think is what's going to be the money maker. Because if this kernel of truth is you really want the kid to love and care and respect you as a parent, then letting them kind of pick some of what the boundaries they want, and obviously some have to be put there for safety anyway, but if you empower them to be a part of that conversation too and finding a middle path, I think it has a better chance of A, working, and B, being what truly does fit his needs.
Okay, I think we're going to be able to come right up to our promised end time of 8 o'clock. Julie Dukowski from Skyland Trail has some closing comments for everyone.
Hi everyone, I'm Julie, and I'm one of our 5 national referral relations representatives. I'm here in Atlanta and cover mostly Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama. And just wanted to take a few minutes to thank everybody for joining us today. We're so glad we could reach so many of you from Texas, Georgia, and actually states from just across the nation. So that is one good thing about being virtual. I hope this evening you're able to glean knowledge and also some practical strategies that will help you as parents support your teens and your children in their emotional, mental, and social development, especially during these very uncertain times. We look forward to continuing to partner with Fusion Academy and Archway Academy in supporting individuals and families, and again, during some very unprecedented, challenging times. So I hope you'll also be able to join us for our next Family Education Series event. It is Parenting for the Launch, which will be held on Tuesday evening, August 4th. Feel free to reach out to any one of us if we can help you in any way. I thank you again. We do hope we'll see you again soon, and have a great evening.